Okay, thanks everyone for being here. It really means a lot to me. So, I'm Christine, and I study adaptive behavior. Although I've done work in a bunch of different fields, healthcare, a little bit of aviation, a little bit of defense acquisitions, a tiny little bit of software development, I don't study those fields. I study adaptive behavior in them. You might say, what is adaptive behavior? You might say it's how practitioners adjust what they do to meet changing demands, challenge, and surprise in their work. A recent book chapter by Woods Rayo adds to that adaptation is not always about changing the plan, model, or previous approaches, but it's about the potential to modify plans to continue to fit changing situations. In an operational sense, you might say adaptive behavior allows an agent to get things done when constrained by a system that doesn't support them well. And adaptive behaviors that contribute to success and to failure can often be the same. Because many of you work in systems that fit that description, some of the insights I've gleaned may be useful for you in your work. We're going to talk about a bunch of different fields, a bunch of different research projects, but one thing we're not going to talk about is software and network operations. And the reason for this is simple. I don't know enough about your world, but I do know a thing or two about adaptive behavior, which means I know something about adaptive behavior in your world. So over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself because I'm from healthcare and I'm new to this community. I'm going to share with you some of what my field has discovered over decades of research in complex systems. I'll offer some insights into reframing work at the systems level, which might help you to better understand what's already happening in your system and how to use the tools you have in conjunction with particular perspectives to create more insight in terms of monitoring for proactive safety and performance. So here's me. When I was working as a nurse, we didn't always dress this way. It was just for Halloween. The nursing program I went through was called a clinical nurse leadership program. And in addition to learning the basic nursing education, we were taught to look across the continuum of care for opportunities to defragment care delivery, thus improving safety and equitable care for patients. So kind of a systems approach, but I didn't know of it that way yet. I changed jobs for a better work schedule, went to the OR. I joined the Safety and Quality Council and found myself in monthly meetings where this screen was covered in tables and spreadsheets and various metrics color-coded in stoplight colors. So this is me saying, how can we learn from this? Is this the best we can do to find and fix what's going on with whoever's on red this month? Do we really need another intervention like this, assigned to discourage OR staff from using this particular machine, which, because it's so old, it's a safety risk, but only for ear, nose, and throat surgery? It worked as far as I know, and I made that sign, but it's super weak. Or should we just complete the mandatory training, the next one, and more to fix things? That's me. I didn't know they took my picture. So why are we looking backwards? Can that get us out in front of the next accident or incident? And why is our scope so narrow? Only looking at what happened this time, but what about last time? And how does that inform us about next time? And what about the rest of the system? How do we make sense of it when it's so crazy? It seems like it doesn't ever make sense. And I didn't have the words for it then, but I do now. And the question I was asking was, how do we get in the tunnel with the system? Not that tunnel, that's a giant colon. Is it this tunnel, maybe? What can we learn about systems that will get us to boldly go where no one has gone before? It's a Jefferies tube, if no one knows Star Trek, which my last name is Jefferies also. And so what I mean is when it comes to getting ahead of the red boxes on my spreadsheet, to get ahead of patient harm, to get ahead of damage from the next winter storm in Texas, or the next train derailment, or the next outage. So here's where I'm at. I'm going to line you up here. The first thing we know is that systems are always changing. And monitoring helps operators make sense of the current state of the system. And it really starts with signal detection, or actually setting up the infrastructure to detect the signals of interest to you. And you already have the digital infrastructure to detect those signals at extremely low cost. You can probably detect 1 billion signals in 1 minute or 1 second for $1 or less. But this isn't true of other systems like healthcare, offshore oil and gas, utilities, maritime. There are many cases in which there's a huge cost associated with establishing that infrastructure, let alone sampling it in a consistent manner. And it turns out that while it's necessary to detect those signals that your system is changing, and it may be helpful to trend those signals, right, because patterns generate more insight, this kind of monitoring is insufficient for helping us understand how the system operates, and woefully incapable of helping us understand the future impacts of choices. So what choices, right? So when people are tasked with accomplishing work and they're in the changing system, they constantly have to adapt. Doing the same thing you've always done in a system that's changing is going to be incrementally less effective as those changes accumulate over time. Your socio-technical system must adapt to meet changing demands and manage operational hazards in a changing environment in order to remain viable in a changing world. And that's whether there's a surge or an outage, or whether this is your first attempt to intervene, or a precise, coordinated team effort to respond. And as you well know, with the mountains of data that you already have at your fingertips, the question remains how to make sense of it all. How to go from collecting this data, plotting it, trending it over time, to get some kind of insight that will inform decisions about what's going to happen next and what to do about it. So when you're looking at individual things, even a bunch of things over time that you can correlate, you still miss the complexity of the system, how things interact, how they're interdependent, what emerges when seemingly disparate parts of your network are activated. The colors change, it's weird. How changing your perspective or incorporating multiple perspectives helps you realize that your system hasn't just leveled up, but it's in a completely different dimension now. Because traditional trending of data doesn't appreciate these kinds of complexity in the system, it encourages overly linear decision making. With pressures in your system driving you forward, you leverage your resources to find and fix so you can get to the next task. This is how people in all kinds of domains get stuck in whack-a-mole actions, solving one problem only for a similar problem that happened in another area. So because systems are always adapting, and they need to be adaptable, they need to adapt to be successful, traditional monitoring about things that happen and the way they come together just isn't enough. Knowing about your system in this way is necessary, but insufficient. What's missing is coming to understand how your socio-technical system adapts. And I don't mean mechanistically how, I mean systemically how. What pressures upregulate and downregulate the options you have available, what operators engage with in perhaps a different way than they would under different circumstances. This is how the people in your system adapt, how they mitigate different kinds of pressures like tempo, production pressure, the push or pull to meet expectations, how they make trade-offs, and how their behavior and their use of various tools adapts to pursue these changing goals. What I really want to share with you today is how we're reframing the context of action from exploring what happens to exploring how it happens. That is, rather than centralizing the sequence of observable actions or events as in traditional monitoring, we centralize monitoring adaptations or monitoring adaptive behavior that successful operators engage in. By placing adaptive behavior at the center of our analysis and by making these findings observable, we help operators understand the pressures that are acting on the system and how those pressures lead to the actions and events which are captured by traditional monitoring. Hang on. And this helps operators understand different approaches in different magnitudes. What happened to my slide? Builds, right? And how they're changing in order to anticipate the adaptive responses of the socio-technical system. So to help us understand the context in which sense is being made and decisions are being enacted, we use pressures, conflicts, and adaptations as a new frame of reference. Because just data values are rarely enough to help you understand why an action was taken. You have to ask different questions of your system to change your perspective and invite multiple perspectives. And not only pressures, conflicts, and adaptations themselves, but patterns of them. So you may recognize this image, the Cook and Rasmussen dynamic safety model. And while this is in the context of safety, you can think of it as a snapshot of the pressures, of the landscape of pressures in any system. You have production pressure, workload, financial, compliance, regulatory, reputational, collegiality. All these pressures exist to do what or achieve what? Goals, right? So we often talk about conflicts in terms of goal conflicts. Pressures coming into conflict that can amplify pressures, dampen goals in favor of other ones, create stalemates or bottlenecks to progress. These system-level pressures are always at play in the way your system adapts. And with growth and change, or just the day-to-day interactions within your system, they'll come into conflict in different ways. And how they play out will also vary. So in a technical or mechanistic system, you can think about changes in terms of events that you can monitor using traditional means. In a socio-technical system, you can't monitor that way because what changes is so much more complex. So we prefer to think of these changes as adaptations, local adaptations and system-level adaptations. So adaptations locally resolve conflicts among competing pressures and goals. The greater the competition, the more opposing these forces, the more difficult the trade-offs are. And in a system sense, local adaptations are locally adaptive. They may or may not be globally adaptive or helpful elsewhere in the system. And if they're not, then you've got more conflict. But only if you know those adaptations are taking place, and only if you know those pressures are in conflict. If you don't, your organization is working against itself, which we know is one of the ways adaptive systems fail, right? Working at cross purposes. So here's our frame of reference, pressures, conflicts, and adaptations. Let's get back to incidents. Over the scope, when we're talking about scope of incident investigation, Rasmussen warned early on that if investigators searched for answers going back from the incident, they would stop at the first plausible point, and that would be a person. Do more, try harder, do more, right? So Woods and Decker later explicitly stated that to avoid this trap, you must start distally and trace the sharp end's actions forward to the incident. Get in the tunnel with them to see how their behavior was rational. However, it was always thought that analysts moving forward through the investigation would naturally see the blunt end pressures and constraints that made sharp end behavior rational. However, this didn't happen. And this is the primary reason when we're teaching people about how to look for pressures, conflicts, and adaptations in their system, that they need to start at the blunt end and distally and trace forwards in time and through layers of the organization towards the incident. Excuse me. So here we've cleaned it up a bit. You can see the progression from blunt to sharp end, from distal in time to proximal in time, and our logical progression of pressures, conflicts, and adaptations. Pressures coming into, competing pressures coming into conflicts, resulting in adaptations, that is adaptive behavior you can see in frontline work. You'll notice that the starburst of the accident is missing, and you'll see in a moment how this works with or without an accident. Now, I want to say it's important to note that often we think about these adaptations as happening only at the front line. But the truth is, this is a cascade. Adaptations, these changes in the system, they create and upregulate and downregulate system pressures that are different or the same pressures and how they're expressed in the system, how they come into conflict under time pressure and uncertainty, and how trade-offs are made. So really everyone, whether you're on your incident response team or you're apportioning budgets or you're writing code, you're all working in this giant cascading milieu of pressures, conflicts, and adaptations. And it doesn't matter your domain. We find this frame of reference to be informative in all kinds of systems. So let me walk you through a few to show you what kinds of insights I'm talking about. So Dana Womack at Oregon Health Sciences University and her team identified changes in nurse activity that may signal an imbalance between patient demand and service supply at the bedside. So these adaptive work strategies include nurses helping other nurses, more use of the patient call button, fewer nurses sitting down or fewer nurses at the nursing station. So when you see these adaptations, you know that these pressures, this throughput pressure, service delivery, and safety, others are all being actively mitigated, and they come into conflict in predictable ways. So your lever in this situation, may be to alleviate workload saturation by infusing resources or deferring work in time, or to implement some kind of human factors intervention that makes it easier to manage work safely. So 2 papers by this team, this is Tarcisio Sorin and his group, they used social network analysis to identify which workers were most frequently contacted for advice, et cetera, in various work tasks in the ICU. And they looked at patterns of aggregate potential for resilient performance among different clusters of workers. So when you employ this type of assessment, you know that practitioners adapt in these ways, in particular ways, and leverage certain social connections to create successful work. And your lever may be to tune your monitoring system to signal when certain work phones are ringing off the hook, or to anticipate and create space, a refractory or recovery period for these heavily burdened expert clinicians who are answering all these phones and giving advice to their colleagues. So let's look at some layers across the organization now. So David Proven's Safety Maturity Model Survey, which has over 500,000 points in it, data points right now, shows this pattern, that the more compliance-focused senior leadership is in the organization, the less deference to expertise happens in the business. That is, decision-making in the organization becomes more driven by hierarchy than by expertise. So when you walk into a workspace that is preoccupied with compliance, this pattern might indicate to you that expertise might be undervalued by upper management in some ways. But you know that expertise is always at play because skilled practitioners find ways to create successful work despite bureaucratic administrative constraints. So the military wants people to be more innovative, and they asked us to look into what was holding them back. We took innovation to be doing something differently than you usually do, i.e. adaptations to competing pressures and goals. And we found that attributes of the acquisition system, like room for failure, autonomy, collaboration, they all supported innovative behavior, but were eroded in particular ways by cyclical time pressures, procedural adherence, and how overtly prioritized innovation actually was. And here's where we build. Knowing that these sets of pressures exist in the system, when you want to make a change or try something new, like encourage a certain behavior, you're going to have to account for these patterns of pressures in the design of your interventions. They give you foresight into how the system is likely to behave when you introduce change. Just some current and ongoing work in sterile processing department at a large Midwestern medical center. This illustrates the transferability of these PCA cascades, these pressures, conflicts, and adaptation cascades. So we interviewed 7 sterile processing practitioners and leaders in a different hospital system, and were able to identify PCA cascades that one by one were validated in our hospital system. And you know what else we learned about pressures in this system? In that same co-design meeting with the department leadership, After nearly 4 hours of really rich discussion around the table about systems insights and systems interventions, we asked them what they thought needed to happen first, what needed to change first. And the first person to respond was a senior leader who said more standardization and more compliance. Tenacious, right? But without asking that question, we wouldn't have known that that pressure was still active in this way, in this system. And you can bet that our proposed interventions are going to take this into account. So you've seen system patterns, but you should know about Katie Walker's work looking at patterns of patterns. Analyzing various catastrophic brittle collapse events in different domains, she was able to identify patterns of PCA cascades that reliably described the erosion of adaptive capacity that eventually manifested in these major accidents. So these indicators of corrosivity include indicators that practitioners are increasingly unable to anticipate changes in their reserve of adaptive options, and indicators that the reserve of adaptive options itself has changed. And this may show up as selective attention to particular kinds of signals, which limit information flow and thus erode capacity to adapt, to anticipate change. So when you see these types of things, you know that adaptive capacity is actively corroding in your organization. It's a red flag you don't want to dismiss, despite the intense pressures you will encounter to dismiss it. And you can see how this type of monitoring is so different than monitoring point values and trends, and how much foresight this approach affords when you're trying to help your organization to learn. And not just learning about where it's been and from accidents and incidents that have happened, but learning to anticipate your system's adaptive capacity, how that's going to come to play during your next incident, as your system has a changing adaptive capacity to detect, interpret, and monitor change, all this at the same time. This gets you learning from incidents to learning for incidents. So maybe your organization is already sensitive to these types of system dimensions, and maybe you're already tooled and resourced to monitor this kind of complexity and connectedness in your organization. But we've found it comes as a surprise to many organizations that revealing PCAs is possible and informative, and indeed really salient to trying to learn how their organizations work, whether that's learning about regular everyday work or learning from incidents. So we've developed a cognitive interviewing tool called SCAD, which gets to revealing how adaptive behavior manifests in the system. It comes in 2 flavors, SCAD for retrospective event analysis and proactive SCAD that you can do tomorrow to learn how dynamic non-events in your system that make up most of your work operations will play out, and how your system is likely to behave during your next incident. So the PCA frame of reference is industry agnostic because it's based on these fundamental operative behaviors of complex adaptive systems. Anywhere you have these central agents adapting to change to get the job done, you're likely to find these patterns. And centralizing the role of adaptive behavior allows you to recognize larger patterns in your system, whether that's healthcare or offshore operations or digital network. As long as your system has the central properties that we talked about at the beginning, you're likely to benefit from this frame of reference. This frame of reference helps us understand the context in which sense is being made and decisions are being enacted and how complexity is being managed. Just data values are rarely enough to help you understand why an action was taken. Instead, you have to ask. Otherwise, you'll be back on the whack-a-mole merry-go-round, and the conditions for incidents will present again and again. So PCA normalizes adaptation as normal work and centralizes the role of adaptive behavior, allowing you to recognize larger patterns in your system. And these, where'd it go? Oh. All right, patterns. And these patterns help get you from learning from incidents to learning for incidents, and that's proactive monitoring. I hope this gives you something a little bit different to think about. Thank you so much for your kind attention.